I got a message from myself 6 hours before I sent it, and I know how that sounds. I really do. Because if someone told me the same thing, I'd assume they either misunderstood something basic or were trying to exaggerate a glitch into a story. But this wasn't like that. This wasn't a weird number or a fake contact or even a duplicate account. It was my actual chat with myself, the same one where you sometimes send notes or links or reminders. Except this time there was a message sitting there that I had absolutely no memory of typing. And it didn't just feel unfamiliar. It felt intentional in a way that made it hard to ignore. Like it had been written with a very specific purpose that I hadn't reached yet. The message itself was simple, almost frustratingly simple, because it didn't explain anything or give me context or even try to make sense. It just said, "Don't trust her." And at that moment it meant nothing to me, because there was no her in my day, no plans to meet anyone, no recent conversation that could connect to it. So my first instinct was to brush it off as a glitch or something I had done accidentally without realizing, because that's always the easiest explanation when something doesn't make sense. And for a few minutes, I actually managed to convince myself that it wasn't a big deal. That changed the moment I noticed the timestamp, because the message wasn't sent recently or even a few minutes ago. It was marked at 7:42 p.m. And when I checked the time on my phone, it was only 1:13 p.m., which immediately made me pause in a way that felt different from confusion, because confusion is something you can usually reason through. But this just sat there without offering any explanation. And I remember checking the time again, locking and unlocking my phone, even opening another app just to make sure the clock was consistent, but everything else was normal. Which somehow made it worse, because it meant the problem wasn't the phone. It was just this one message existing where it shouldn't. I tried to ignore it after that, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. And ignoring something is always easier than trying to understand it when there's no clear starting point. But the problem with ignoring something like that is that it doesn't stay quiet. It just waits. And about 20 minutes later, my phone buzzed again with another message in the same chat, from the same contact, from me. And this time it said, "You're going to meet her today," which immediately made everything feel more deliberate, because now it wasn't just a warning, it was a continuation, like a conversation that had already started somewhere else and I was just stepping into the middle of it. I remember staring at that second message for a long time before replying. Because texting yourself is one of those things that feels ridiculous even when you have a reason. But at the same time, not replying felt worse. Like ignoring it might somehow make things spiral in a way I wouldn't understand until it was too late. So I typed, "Who?" and sent it. And the moment I did, I felt this strange tension, like I'd crossed a line that I couldn't step back over. For a few seconds, nothing happened, and I almost convinced myself that would be the end of it. But then the typing indicator appeared, those 3 small dots moving in a way that shouldn't have been possible because they were coming from my own number. And I don't think I've ever felt something so small look so wrong, because it wasn't dramatic or loud. It was just quietly impossible. And when the reply finally came, it didn't help at all. It just said, "You'll know," which somehow managed to make everything feel even less stable. At that point, I tried calling my own number, not because I thought it would work, but because I needed to do something that felt logical, something that belonged to the normal world. But instead of ringing or failing, the call just showed as busy, like someone was actively using my number. And that was the moment where the situation shifted from confusing to unsettling. Because now there was no simple explanation left that felt believable. I spent the next hour trying to force one anyway, going through my phone, checking apps, restarting everything, even looking into settings I didn't fully understand, hoping I'd find something that explained it, but everything looked completely normal. And that normality started to feel intentional, like whatever was happening didn't want to be found through obvious means, which made the messages feel more in control than I was. At some point during that hour, another message appeared without any notification, just silently added to the chat like it had always been there. And it said, "I wouldn't ignore me if I were you," which made me realize that whatever this was, it wasn't just reacting to me, it was anticipating me. And that idea settled in a way that was hard to shake, because it meant I wasn't just dealing with something strange, I was dealing with something that already knew how I would respond. I asked what it wanted, and the reply came after a short pause. To help you. And there was something about that phrasing that didn't feel reassuring, because help usually comes with explanation, and this didn't. It just assumed I would follow along, so I asked how. And it said, just follow what I say, which felt less like guidance and more like instruction. And when I asked what would happen if I didn't, the response came almost instantly. You already did that once, followed by another message that said, and it didn't end well, which introduced something new into the situation, something worse than confusion or fear, because now there was history involved, something I didn't remember but was somehow part of. I left the house after that, not because I had a plan, but because staying inside felt wrong, like the space itself was becoming part of the problem. And as I walked, trying to clear my head, another message came telling me to go to the cafe I usually visit. And I hesitated for a moment because following instructions from something I didn't understand felt like giving up control. But at the same time, I didn't have a better option. So I went. The cafe looked completely normal when I arrived. The same quiet atmosphere, the same low noise of people talking. And for a few minutes I almost believed that coming there had broken whatever pattern was forming. But then the door opened and she walked in. And the moment I saw her, that word came back again, familiar, not in a clear way, but in a subtle, uncomfortable way, like recognizing a place from a dream you can't fully remember. She looked around briefly, and then walked straight to my table, smiling in a way that felt natural but slightly too certain, and when she asked if the seat was taken, I hesitated just long enough to remember the first message, don't trust her. But I still said yes because ignoring something that normal would have felt irrational, and she sat down like everything was exactly as it should be. Her name was Ria, and the conversation started easily, almost too easily, like there was no effort required to keep it going. And at one point she finished a sentence I hadn't fully spoken yet, not in a guessing way, but exactly, word for word, which made me pause internally even though I didn't react outwardly, because something about that felt less like coincidence and more like repetition. When my phone buzzed again and showed the message, you didn't listen. It didn't feel like a warning anymore. It felt like confirmation that something had already gone wrong. And when I asked what I was supposed to do, the reply said, watch carefully, which didn't make sense until her phone buzzed a few minutes later and she checked it quickly, just for a second, but long enough for me to see that the chat on her screen was also with me. The same name, the same picture, the same impossible situation happening from the other side. That was the moment everything shifted. Because now it wasn't just me experiencing something strange. It was shared, connected. And when I left the cafe after that, it wasn't out of confusion anymore. It was because staying felt like stepping deeper into something I didn't understand. The message telling me to go home came quickly after, and I followed it without thinking, because by then I'd already started trusting the instructions more than my own judgment. And when I reached my door and found it unlocked, despite being certain I had locked it, there was no surprise left, just a quiet acceptance that something was waiting for me inside. The voice I heard from my room confirmed it before I even saw him, because it was my voice, speaking in a calm, steady tone. And when I finally reached the doorway and saw him sitting there, holding my phone, looking exactly like me in every detail, the situation didn't feel shocking in the way I expected. It felt inevitable, like this was always where things were leading. He spoke like he already knew everything I was going to ask, answering questions before I finished them, explaining that he was me, just later, and that this wasn't the first time this had happened, that the messages were part of a loop I kept entering, thinking I could change something, thinking I could fix it, and every time ending up in the same place. When he said that meeting her was the trigger, that it allowed something to continue across timelines, something that remembered each iteration even when I didn't, The idea settled into place in a way that made everything before it feel like setup. And when my phone buzzed with messages telling me not to let him stay, while he calmly explained that he would replace me like he always had, it became clear that the messages weren't guiding me forward. They were trying to break a pattern that had already been completed more times than I could remember. Running felt like the only option left, not because I believed it would work, but because standing there guaranteed it wouldn't. And as I ran, the messages kept coming, warning me that he already knew what I would do, that every path I could take had already been taken before. And when the final message told me to turn around, I understood before I even moved that the outcome wasn't going to change. He was there, exactly where the message said he would be, holding the phone that had been guiding me, reading the same warnings I had followed. And when he looked at me and smiled, there was no urgency or tension left in his expression, just certainty, the kind that comes from repeating something enough times that it stops feeling unpredictable. When he said, "Told you I always win," it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a conclusion, like the final line in something that had already ended long before I understood it. And in that moment, the idea that the messages were coming from me in the future stopped feeling like the most important detail. Because the real problem wasn't where they came from. It was that they were never enough to change what was already going to happen. If this felt real, that's because it was almost real. I'll see you in the next memory.